Thank you all for joining us today for episode 17, The Mother Movement. Today, we're going to do something a little bit different. We have been going through the evolution of Hamas in the United States from beginning, and we're working our way to present. We're also discussing how Hamas evolved abroad. But today, for episode 17, we're going to pause in that chronological documentary, and we're going to take a few moments to talk about Hamas and its mother movement, the Muslim Brotherhood. Here with us today, we have Dr. Lorenzo Vidino to talk to us about the Muslim Brotherhood and what that movement is all about.
I'm Lorenzo Vidino. I'm the director of the program on extremism at George Washington University. I have been studying the Muslim Brotherhood for basically 25 years. I got interested in the topic because it's a personal story. I grew up in a neighborhood that had a very radical mosque back in the 90s. It was sort of the gateway to go to Bosnia to fight. So all foreign fighters that went to Bosnia to fight, or most foreign fighters, went through that mosque in Milan and received documents, training, and different kinds of support from the local network. It was a quintessential jihadist mosque, but digging into that mosque, and at the time I was studying, but I was a reporter for a local newspaper, we identified the fact that that mosque was owned by members of the Muslim Brotherhood, by very senior and very wealthy members of the Muslim Brotherhood. So from that moment on, to me, it's been interesting to see how those two words intersect, the word of jihadists, of groups like Al-Qaeda, people who fight terrorists, and people who dress in a suit and a tie, a very respectable businessman, but at the same time flirt with the same ideology and provide support to jihadists. So from that day on, I've been interested in the topic, been studying it 25 years. I've written 2 books about it. I interviewed probably close to 100 members of the Muslim Brotherhood, former members of the Brotherhood. My second book is in fact based on interviews with people who left the Muslim Brotherhood. I try to get information from as many sources as possible. The Brotherhood is a very complex group that acts on many levels. So I try to get, of course, internal writings of the Brotherhood, speeches. I try to see how their members act on social media. I also try to dig into their financial records. I try to, of course, see what governments, security services know and say about them. And it's really about making all these different sources of information come together to try to shed some light on a very complex, very opaque organization. The Muslim Brotherhood is the oldest and most influential Islamist group. It was founded in 1928 in Egypt by Hassan al-Banna, and the core idea was a rejection of colonialism and Western foreign influences in Egyptian and Muslim societies, and a return to an idealized Muslim past. Al-Banna's idea was that the Islamic world was in a state of crisis, was being colonized and controlled externally because it was weak, because it had abandoned its Muslim Islamic ideals. So what Al-Banna saw was a system in which Islam controls, shapes all aspects of life, both private and public, and therefore creates a perfect Islamic system of governance. What Al-Banna also created with the Muslim Brotherhood was not just an ideology, but a methodology, a system. The Brotherhood referred to the past, but used very modern systems of disseminating its ideas, of organizing itself. And that's why it became quite successful. It was this mix of a powerful idea together with a very effective methodology of action, led the Brotherhood to gain a lot of supporters, first in Egypt, and then over the years, by the 1940s, 50s, to all Arab countries and to virtually all Muslim majority countries. So pretty much every Islamist group, and by Islamist we mean groups that use Islam as an ideology, as a political ideology, trace their origins, at least from an ideological point of view, to the Muslim Brotherhood. Islam is a religion. It's a religion adopted by 1.5 billion people around the world. It has, of course, some elements that one could describe as political, because, of course, parts of the religion are unquestionably related to aspects of life and regulate aspects of life. But Islamism is a very different thing because it's a political ideology, a political project built on a very selective, literalist, at times twisted interpretation of Islam. So there's a big difference between the two, and Islamism has to do with politics and not religion. In Muslim majority countries, the goal of the Muslim Brotherhood is that of creating perfect Islamic societies, is to spread their ultra-conservative and politicized interpretation of Islam to the general population. And from there, as a natural consequence, create Islamic states, Islamic regimes, where Islamic law, interpreted in their very conservative and strict way, is adopted as the only source of law. The idea is then that all these states, so the contemporary states of the Muslim world, once properly Islamized, would also come together in a supranational entity that would be the caliphate. Unlike jihadist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, the Brotherhood doesn't want to utilize violence, or at least only violence, to achieve these goals. Its main idea is that of dawah, proselytism, dissemination of its ideology, and gradualism, trying to achieve this goal gradually. At the same time, the Brotherhood does not reject the use of violence. It simply calls for a more, let's say, contextualized, tactical use of violence. It will select which tactic to use, whether violence or not, based on assessment of the circumstances in a specific environment, while groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS want to use violence and only violence. By the 1950s and 1960s, most Arab regimes started to see the Muslim Brotherhood as a substantial threat to their own stability. They were mostly secular regimes, and they staunchly opposed the Brotherhood. So they started cracking down on the group. And what happened is that leaders or members of the Brotherhood in Egypt, in Syria, in other Arab countries started fleeing the region, and several of them obtained political asylum in the West, in Europe and in North America. So that's sort of the embryo of the Muslim Brotherhood presence. It's not a plot by the Brotherhood to set up a presence in the West. It kind of happened serendipitously. But what also happened is that at the time, students from the Middle East were coming to Western universities, and American universities in particular, to further their studies. And a few of those students from the Middle East were members or sympathizers of the Brotherhood. So what we start to see on the ground, particularly when it comes to the United States in universities in the Midwest, is that we see the first formations of small clusters of senior members of the Brotherhood who have obtained political asylum, and junior members or sympathizers who have come as students, and they come together and form the first infrastructure of the Brotherhood at the time. Very small at the time, the first mosques, the first student organizations, the first newspapers, the first conferences, and they replicate, obviously on a micro level, the very same dynamics and structures of their countries of origin. The first student organization that is created, and is one that is still active today, is the Muslim Student Association. So the students with an Islamist background from different countries, some were from Arab countries, some were even Shia, some were from sub-Saharan Africa, but Arabs were the ones sort of leading together with Kurds, were the ones leading this organization. They came together from different campuses, mostly in the Midwest, and they created in the early 60s the Muslim Student Association. Now, in typical Brotherhood fashion, we see two dynamics from the beginning. The first is that these organizations don't call themselves the Muslim Student Association, and then the others that will be spawned later, don't call themselves Muslim Brotherhood. They don't openly identify themselves as Muslim Brotherhood. And that's a pattern that we will see until today. There's no organization in the West that openly recognizes its affiliation to the Brotherhood. The reason for that is that they understand that openly identifying themselves as such would open them to a variety of negative consequences that would range from possibly prosecution or negative security implications for them, even though the Brotherhood is not a designated terrorist organization in any Western country, is still seen negatively and suspiciously by virtually all security services. And on a political level, they understand that being affiliated with the Brotherhood is not a great selling point. The tactics that these groups have adopted in the West is that of being seen or trying to be seen as moderate representative interlocutors, moderate representative of the Muslim community and interlocutors of Western political establishments. Closely being associated to the Brotherhood is not exactly something that is advantageous when one tries to do so, because of course the Brotherhood in the Middle East is openly anti-Semitic, anti-Western, has positions that are unacceptable from a Western point of view. So creating at least this, trying to create this perception that these entities have nothing to do with the Brotherhood in the Middle East is something that helps them in their attempt to be seen as moderate representatives of the Muslim community and engaging Western establishments. The embryo that was created in the 50s, the 60s, the Muslim Student Association, grew spectacularly in the following 30, 40 years. And that's for a variety of reasons. One is a larger number of people coming from the Middle East and just increasing the size of these networks. The second is, in typical Brotherhood fashion, their activism, their ability of the members in the United States to create an infrastructure. We have to remember that the Brotherhood is a very selective organization. No one applies to be a member. You are selected based on a variety of skills that the spotters within the Brotherhood identify, and being extremely clever, extremely well educated, extremely driven are some of the key features they look for. It's an elite group. I'm hard pressed to think of any Brotherhood member who doesn't have at least one graduate degree. And so these people are very good at understanding the environments and creating structures, and of course being driven by ideology. The third overlapping factor that led to this growth in Brotherhood structures is the access to ample funding. From the 1960s, but particularly in the 70s, the Brotherhood in the United States, as in all Western countries, managed to have access to massive amounts of funding coming from Arab Gulf countries, mostly. From Saudi Arabia to other Gulf countries, whether it was state funding or funding from individual donors, we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars flowing in and funding the growth of this network, funding the construction of mosques, funding the creation of the myriad of organizations that spawned from the cluster of the Muslim Student Association. So by the 1980s, we can talk of maybe 50, 60 organizations at the national level, and then more at the local level, that are part of this network. It's always the same group of people. It's always the same very tight-knit milieu of individuals, all interconnected to one another by family ties, by organizational ties, by financial ties. Very often there's intermarriage between members of the Brotherhood, and obviously ideology is the connecting tissue among all of them. But it's a very relatively small cluster of, in a large country like the US, a few thousand individuals, but nonetheless have managed to create a massive infrastructure. Well, because America is a crucially important country and it shapes the destiny of the world and in the Middle East in particular. By the 1980s, the leadership of the global Muslim Brotherhood have understood that the presence of the movement in Western country, from something that just happened, as we discussed, had become something permanent and growing. And the idea, and there's a very famous book written by Yusuf al-Qaradawi, which at the time was the spiritual leader of the Muslim Brotherhood based out of Qatar, extremely influential. And he basically said, this presence is something we should exploit. We should use this presence in the West to do a variety of things. One of them is controlling Muslim communities, being able to spread our view of Islam to the diaspora communities in the West in a way that we cannot do back in the Middle East, because in the West we can enjoy freedoms that we cannot back in the Middle East. But the second goal that Qaradawi describes is that of influencing policy making in Western capitals. The idea that the structures, the networks that the Brotherhood created in the West almost by chance in the 50s and 60s had grown and could become a lobbying group, could play the game and start influencing policy making on issues that matter to them. And that means influencing, for example, positions in the West on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, on the Muslim Brotherhood itself, on how the West views the movement. And the idea was conceived of then really once the establishment phase of the Brotherhood was over, and that's by the 1980s, to move to the second phase, which is to influence opinions and policy in the West. And there are documents, including some that have been seized in the United States in operations carried out by the FBI and then later introduced as evidence in the Holy Land Foundation case, that show that in the typical Brotherhood fashion of being very deliberate, very strategic, very bureaucratic, so all these documents, these memos, exactly like if we're talking about a big corporation and a board meeting and senior officials in that company discussing the strategic future of that company, Brotherhood members in America were doing the same and still do the same, which is to strategize about the future. And there's a document in particular that talk about how the movement should influence policy making in America, but with the ultimate goal of, and the quote here is pretty spectacular, is sabotaging their miserable house from the inside. The idea that at the end of the day, we're going to influence American opinion and policy making, but with the idea of eventually destroying America, which is of course seen as the ultimate enemy of the Muslim Brotherhood, the ultimate obstacle in the way of what the Brotherhood wants to obtain in the Middle East. From the very beginning, the Brotherhood, and this is typical Brotherhood modus operandi, the brothers created dozens and dozens of organizations. There's different reasons as to why the brothers do that. One is specialization. Every entity works on a specific task. Some are more engaged in charitable activities, some more in financial, some more in political, some more in educational. So even though it's kind of the same group of people that controls them, they're specialized. The second reason is conveying an image of being a large entity. So if, for example, a petition for a certain foreign policy topic is signed by 50 organizations, it's impressive. Now, if one digs a bit deeper, one will see that behind those 50 organizations, there's the very same cluster of maybe 200 activists, and it's all overlapping boards and overlapping directors. But still, it conveys a certain image. And the third is the idea that if one of these organizations falls, the others can survive. You don't put all your eggs in one basket. So by the 1980s, driven by these three reasons, the brothers create entities like the Islamic Society of North America, like Triple IT, which is more the think tank, like NATE, North American Islamic Trust, which is the entity that controls the deeds, the real estate, basically, of the network. There's entities that focus more on education. There's entities that focus more on politics. So it's a very complex web of entities, and again, it conveys with different messages. Well, Palestine has always been a central topic for the Muslim Brotherhood. That goes back to the late 40s when Hassan al-Banna had made it a central part of what the Brotherhood was fighting for. And Brotherhood members were carrying out activities in Palestine, violent activities in Palestine, even before 1948. So when Hamas, which is by its own charter the branch of the Muslim Brotherhood in the Palestinian territories, when Hamas was created, the global Muslim Brotherhood, of course, came to support it. It's the global branch, it's a local branch of the global family, and it is fighting in a very crucial, very symbolic spot. So the network globally came to support it, and that took place all over the Middle East, all over the West, and of course also in America. Of course, America being particularly important because the positions that Washington adopts on the Israeli-Palestinian conflicts have an impact on the conflict itself. So what happened shortly after the foundation of Hamas is that the American network of the Brotherhood, and more specifically the Palestinian component, because the Brotherhood network in America is composed of people from different countries of origin, but there's always been a very substantial Palestinian component. They created a specific committee whose task was to work on the Palestinian cause. By Palestinian cause, that of course means supporting Hamas in different ways. And those different ways range from financial support to education, meaning spreading Hamas view and creating sympathy for Hamas within the Muslim community, and also providing political support to Hamas. By the early 90s, some of the core members of the Brotherhood in America felt that some of the organizations they had created and controlled for a long time were no longer purely Muslim Brotherhood. They had grown in size. There were people as part of them that were, of course, Islamist leaning, but not necessarily members of the Brotherhood. And so they created an entity that was supposed to be 100% Muslim Brotherhood, more closely reflecting the ideology and the organizational method of the Brotherhood. And that is the Muslim American Society, which was created in the early 90s in a meeting that took place between Alabama and Tennessee. The head of the Muslim Brotherhood from Egypt flew in for that meeting. That tells you, again, the importance that the Brotherhood network in America has for the global network of the Muslim Brotherhood. And that organization was created. Now, as for other organizations, and that's a common source of controversy, the question is always how closely connected to the Muslim Brotherhood in the Middle East is an organization like MAS, like the Muslim American Society, or other organizations that have been created by the Brotherhood. Are they organizationally dependent, or do they just have the same roots, same ideological roots, but there's no organizational and operational connection to the Middle East? Now, of course, these organizations claim the latter, that there's no real operational connection. I think often case what we find is that reality is a bit different. And while it might not be true that on every single decision that an offshoot of the Brotherhood in the West takes, the orders are dictated from the Middle East. But it is true that there is coordination, that there are systems of overlap, that when one action is taken in Egypt or in other countries, immediately the organization in the West adopts those measures and those positions. Members can put, this is from a bureaucratic organizational point of view, a member in Egypt can transfer their membership to the organization in America, exactly like one would move from one branch of the same, say, University of California system to another. So the connection that exists between groups like MAS and others in the US to the Brotherhood in the Middle East is not as weak and dated as it's sometimes portrayed. Well, the Muslim Brotherhood has always been seen as a threat by the secular regimes of the Arab and Muslim world, while others, particularly some of the Gulf countries, had a different relationship with the group. Now, each country should be analyzed separately, but in general, Gulf countries supported the Brotherhood, at least supported the Brotherhood abroad, not so much in their own on their own territory. But a lot of these dynamics really changed with the Arab Spring. So starting in 2011, when the Brotherhood gained power democratically in Egypt, in Tunisia, and in some other ways also became influential in other countries like Libya. That, of course, created shockwaves in the region. Islamist governments or Brotherhood leaders started basically declaring that Cairo today, Riyadh tomorrow. So they immediately started projecting an image of wanting to create this sort of Islamist superstate or overthrow regimes throughout the region. I think it's fair to say that the relationship between the Brotherhood and democracy is a contested one at best. The Brotherhood, being the quintessential pragmatic movement, will participate in elections, but it doesn't mean that it has a deep belief in the concept of democracy. It simply sees the democratic process as a way to obtain power. This is what Erdogan in Turkey said back in the 90s. We'll use democracy like a streetcar, we'll ride it until we need it, and then we'll get off. Meaning that there's not a deep belief in it, it's just useful to participate in the democratic process because it leads them to power. The Brotherhood in Egypt and in Tunisia obtained power democratically, then took some actions that were seen by many as anti-democratic. And then there was a counter coup in Egypt that overthrew the Brotherhood-led government of Mohamed Morsi.
And so when we talk about the overthrow of the Muslim Brotherhood regime in Egypt, we take a look at what the US-based Hamas infrastructure or some of its leaders were, how they responded to that. As you might expect, the American Muslims for Palestine, through its leader, Osama Abu Arshad, was quite opposed to that.
In the region, that led a lot of governments to really be very wary of the Muslim Brotherhood, and all Gulf countries, with the very notable exception of Qatar, started taking a very different position on the Brotherhood. Basically, the Brotherhood became public enemy number one in Saudi Arabia, in the UAE, in Bahrain, obviously in Egypt post counter revolution. And the Brotherhood has been designated as a terrorist organization in all these countries. Some of these countries that used to support the Brotherhood and the Brotherhood in the West financially for a long time started doing the complete opposite, which is opposing the Brotherhood and actually going to Western countries with which we've been allies for decades and try to convince them that the Brotherhood is a nefarious group that shows itself with a moderate facade, but in reality, it's seeking to to overthrow regimes and fights against democracy. So the geopolitics of this has changed substantially in the Middle East. I think it is designated in 4 countries, which is Egypt, UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Bahrain. Other countries would look at it with suspicion at best. Jordan also recently outlawed the Brotherhood. That's fairly recent. Other governments seek to, at times, appease, keep at bay, sometimes crack down on the Brotherhood. Bottom line, throughout the region is seen with suspicion at best. The US has a very complex relationship with the Brotherhood, and one that I would characterize as incoherent. Generally speaking, the US does not see the Brotherhood in a positive way. It sees it as problematic, anti-Western, anti-American, anti-democratic. I think there's a general understanding of that. But first of all, it has at times historically flirted with the Muslim Brotherhood, thinking that it could be a tactical ally in certain battles. During the Cold War, the Brotherhood was seen as potentially an ally against communist regimes. The Brotherhood hated the communists as by virtue of being against religion. So part of the US political establishment thought that they could be allies against the Soviets and Soviet-influenced regimes in the region. Fast forward to the Arab Spring, the US government at the time did not see the rise to power of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and Tunisia as something completely negative, and it sought to create a constructive relationship with it, something that did not really materialize and something that was seen as a betrayal by a lot of our long-standing allies in the region. I would say at the same time, it's fair to say that the Brotherhood enjoys some sympathy in some quarters of the American political establishment. I think that's very fair to say that it's seen with sympathy by large swaths of academia, and within State Department, within some government agencies, I think there are several people who don't see the Brotherhood as problematic. But it's not to say that large parts of the American political establishment do not have the opposite position and do see the Brotherhood as problematic. The bottom line is that there's not a coherent policy. It's sort of erratic at times. It is not a designated terrorist organization. There have been bills in the past, 2 of them very recently, as of July, that have been introduced in Congress to designate the Brotherhood as a terrorist organization, but it has never happened. Oh, there is no question that all the programmatic documents, including the 99 or 91 documents, so very similar documents that were retrieved in other investigations in Europe, where they really say the same things that those found in the United States. That strategy has been translated, at least in attempts, by Brotherhood networks over the last 30 years on the ground in the United States and other Western countries. There's no question that that gradualist strategy of creating a presence, creating tactical alliances, be seen as moderate interlocutor, infiltrate the establishment, radicalize the local Muslim population, but do so in a very quiet way to obtain power and sort of, as those documents say, sabotage from the inside. It's a strategy that is very clear to see if one pays attention at the full picture. It doesn't stop at the statements that are made by Brotherhood leaders who claim the complete opposite, claim to be constructive engagement partners. But a dry analysis of the activities of the Brotherhood on the ground of the last 40, 50 years clearly shows that they've been engaged in implementing that strategy.